All right, it is Thursday, the 13th of November, 2025. My name is Chris Hattingh. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. Thank you all for making time on this Thursday morning to join us for this latest CRA briefing on the 2025 medium-term budget policy statement delivered yesterday by the Minister of Finance, Minister Enoch Godongwana. We're going to unpack the MTBPS, say that a few times fast, see how sharp your mind is this morning, but we're going to go into all of that. We're going to look at implications for the GNU. How is that functioning or not functioning? We actually had a cabinet reshuffle yesterday that maybe lost in all the excitement around a pretty good MTBPS. So we'll get into some implications there. We will also do a little bit of a preview for the upcoming G20 summit, of course, being hosted in Johannesburg on the 22nd and 23rd of November. For those of us in Johannesburg, if you're not aware, I am in Johannesburg as well. But for those of you in Johannesburg who are not aware, prepare yourselves accordingly for the traffic implications of the G20 summit. Make sure that you have all of that set up well before next weekend. But just before I hand over to Anlu for the main presentation, I will also introduce my colleague Ofentse Davhie from the CRA, a research associate. Anlu, of course, at the Institute of Race Relations, our economic policy analyst. In terms of house rules, housekeeping, admin, please feel free to add comments at whatever platform you might be watching today's briefing. We will field your questions and discussion points after Anlu's presentation. The session will also be recorded, so if for whatever reason you need to drop off, if your electricity leaves you in the lurch or your Wi-Fi connection, you can always come back to the link and you can watch the recording then. All right, final point from my side. I think overall first impressions on the medium-term budget, pretty good one, all things considered. However, keep in mind that National Treasury revised downwards their forecast for South Africa's GDP growth this year from 1.4% to 1.2%. So some of the fundamentals are looking good. Our debt trajectory is stabilizing based on the latest data, and Anlu will tell us more about that. However, our growth situation remains very difficult. We're not attracting enough investment, especially real fixed investment, and also our economy is not growing to keep pace with population growth. So South Africa still remains below the 1.5% growth ceiling for the time being. Of course, we hope to break out of that, but just manage expectations. Don't get caught too much up in the hype. We'll get into all of the implications of the mini budget right away. So Anlu, with all of that said, thank you very much. I hand over to you. We look forward to your presentation on the 2025 medium-term budget policy statement.
Thank you, Chris, and good day to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am going to fall with the door in the house. I think that's the saying. So lekkerder in Afrikaans. Anyway, and we'll look through the most recent MTBPS or midterm budget policy statement as it was delivered yesterday. So yeah, this is the every year government puts out two budgets. This is the review of the budget that was published in May of this year. We obviously had a bit of budget drama. Okay, so our agenda for today, we will look at government collects money. It does so primarily through taxes. So we'll have a look at government's revenue. Next, we'll look at where and how government allocates these funds. We'll then discuss the gap that it creates when government spends more than it earns, and this causes a deficit. And then to cover this deficit, government has resorted to borrowing, which leads to rising debt levels. And then finally, we'll analyze how these four elements interact and affect the economy, and then ultimately show you what the point of this budget was and what the reviews were. Very well. So for revenue, let's have a look at government's income. So tax revenue was adjusted upwards. There was 19.7 billion rand in additional tax revenue they expect for the 2025-26 year. And then there's this note on the revision for the buoyancy rate. Now, we don't usually include this here, but I think it's important because it's quite a revision this year. The buoyancy rate, essentially, when it's more than one, it shows that tax revenue is growing faster than the economy is. And this means then for here, for every 1% increase in economic growth, tax revenue increases at 1.54%. Okay, so let's have a look at where taxes is coming from. Where's the government's revenue coming from? So to understand this graph, it's easiest to imagine a bucket and you need to fill it with taxes. Okay, so individuals, they pay personal income tax, that's the red bar. They put roughly 730 billion rand in the government's budget bucket. And then we have companies putting roughly 319 billion rand into the bucket. And now notice that we are already, between individuals and companies, we've filled the bucket nearly 60%. Then we add to this value-added tax that contributes roughly 458 billion rand. And then finally, other smaller taxes like custom duties and fuel levies, those add 350 billion rand, roughly 350 billion rand. So it's important to understand where the government's tax revenue comes from, because it tells us that government relies heavily on individuals and companies to fund their operations. As we could see here, that individuals and companies contribute 57%, almost 60% to government's revenue. So increasing taxes means that a certain group will carry a disproportional heavier burden. And then, of course, it also emphasizes this point that government is reliant on private individuals and businesses to actually do well, because that will then affect their revenue contribution. So knowing this, I want us to zoom in a little bit. Personal income tax makes up the largest share of government revenue. So let's look at personal income tax specifically, and then we'll see just how concentrated this burden is. Okay, so this slide shows us who actually pays personal income tax and then how much they pay. So here we see that there's almost 10 million taxpayers. They contribute just 4.9% of personal income tax. These people earn between 0 and 250,000 rand. Then the next group, this consists of 3.5 million taxpayers. They earn between 250,000 and 750,000 a year, and they pay roughly 35% of personal income tax. And then finally, the smallest group here, about 980,000 people, they earn more than 750,000 rand per year. But this group pays most in terms of personal income tax. They cover roughly 60% of all personal income tax. So if we step back a bit and we look at the picture of this personal income tax, then we see that essentially there's the top two groups, they pay for 95% of all personal income tax, of all personal income tax revenue that the government collects. So again, this emphasizes that point that South Africa has a very narrow tax base and it's problematic for various reasons. Okay, so now we'll move on to how Treasury has allocated and reallocated these funds. This is obviously the medium-term budget policy statement. So they have already allocated earlier the year and then they have revised now. Okay, so understanding where the money goes is important because it tells us what government considers priorities. So firstly, the main budget expenditure was revised upwards. They will now spend 2.32 trillion rand. It seems like quite a small adjustment, but remember that it is not 1 rand, it is trillions. Then consolidated expenditure. So this is when we include additional spending like other public entities and funds. Then that is estimated to be, or revised rather, to 2.59 trillion rand. So the picture that this gives us is that despite the pressure that we're under and despite Treasury revising our growth down, spending is still growing. And keep in mind that this is at a rate almost 5-fold the rate that the economy is growing. So the important question here is, where's the money actually going? And that is that point that I just made, that there's an additional spending of 15.8 billion rand. Okay, so let's break it down into 4 main categories. So the focus is not so much on the shift here between 1994. If you're interested, you're welcome to look at it afterwards, but the slides will be available. but the focus is on the allocated spending for 2025 and the revisions that were made. So look at the red bars. The largest spending, that is nearly 60%, goes towards social spending. This includes your grants, your healthcare, education. Then after spending on, thereafter spending on general public services and state debt costs, that's an estimated 20%. Excuse me. Then less than 11% of the budget goes towards economic development. And then finally, for peace and security spending, that's roughly 10%. So I'm showing you this because it's almost a zoomed out view of what government considers their priorities, which is clearly social spending. And I want to specifically point out, just in terms of long-term priority changes, that there's a massive increase in social spending. That's on the far left corner, the yellow bar. A massive increase in spending on social grants. And then, of course, if you look at the peace and security spending, you can see that there's been a decrease since 1994. Okay, so now we are looking at, first, let me say, before you think this graph is overwhelming, we're going to break it down in pieces. So, but what we're looking at here is government's expenditure, and this is as a proportion of their total expenditure. So of everything that they spend, where are they spending it and how much on each line item? So let's start with the red bar. That is our government spending most on education. That's 19% of all our expenditure. Then the second largest expenditure item is the very light yellow, almost a creamy color. That's at 16.4% of expenditure. That was revised down from 16.8%. And then that is on social protection. And of course, the saying goes that there's nothing as permanent as a temporary social grant. So this can't be a better explanation of exactly that point. Then our very top bar, that gray, this is our debt servicing costs, and that accounts for 16.3% of all expenditure. And of course, notice here that it is gray. This is not by accident. It's essentially dead money. It's money that can't be spent productively anywhere else. And this is important because if we're not careful, obviously now we've seen that government has said we are stabilizing this here, but that does not mean that there's not a risk of debt still running away with us. We are still in very, very high territory. Okay. A couple of risks that still exist and that are still risks to the fiscus. On this list, some of the noteworthy items, and I'm not going to go into detail of them, but some of these items include, of course, the Expropriation Act, National Health Insurance and the cost associated with that. Still, the risk of basic income grant and the cost associated with that. The public sector wage bill, that is still very high. We have seen earlier this year the wage agreements and the 7.3 billion rand increase that was allocated to that to cover for the state employees. Then, of course, municipality debts. We again saw the minister mentioning this in his speech yesterday. Multiple municipalities across the country owes Eskom extensive debts. And then, of course, we have our SOE bailouts. We have infrastructure drive that was again mentioned yesterday, that they'd like to increase that to over 1 trillion rand over the next 3 years. And we need to keep in mind that many of these infrastructure projects depends on the efficiency and the quality of those projects. Of course, the follow-through of those projects. And then, of course, our debt servicing costs, very, very important. We will get to that in a minute. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Just as a recap, we've now looked at revenue, we've looked at expenses, and we noted that the government still spends more than it earns. But let's have a look at the deficit that it creates. And there was quite a bit of a revision here. So the deficit was revised down from 4.8% to now 4.5%. It is still a deficit. However, the primary surplus, so this is that, obviously the primary surplus, just as an explanation, it means that all non-interest spending is covered by revenue. So every time we don't have enough money, we borrow, but if we have a primary surplus, without paying our interest, we can cover all our day-to-day costs. I quite like Davhie's explanation of this. It is useful and it is important, but it is kind of like a house spending on everything, or when they do their budget, they allocate money to everything except their debt, which is essentially useless. But it is important to note that we are continuing this multi-year primary surplus that we have running now. Okay, and then of course, let's have a look at, so I'm going to stand still at this graph for a moment, but we'll look at the revenue and then the expenditure and how the deficit has been over the longer term. Okay, so here, the light yellow bars or orange bars, those are our revenue. Then the red bars, that is expenditure. And then this gray black line, that indicates our deficit. Just quickly going to remove it for a moment. I want you to note here that the red bars are consistently higher than the orange bars. The only time that it is not higher was between 2006 and 2008. And this is, of course, under Trevor Manuel. Then let's add the black line back. And here, the black line, our deficit or surplus. Note again that difference that I just pointed out in the red bars exceeding the yellow bars. The only time that the black line is above the zero, which use the right-hand axis, is in 2006 and 2008. Okay, and now let's shift our attention to the dark gray and light gray lines on the right hand. These are the revised estimates. And then you can see a clear trend there of decrease in the expenditure, which is the darker gray lines. Apologies, it's a bit more difficult to distinguish them if they are both gray. I should consider changing that. But the dark gray ones, which are the longer lines, those have a decreasing trend. And those are, of course, the revised estimates. Treasury thinking or estimating that our deficit will continue to decrease. Okay, so I want to just remind you of what we said in the beginning, that to cover this deficit that we still very clearly see, government resorts to borrowing money. And this then brings us to our debt and the rising debt levels that we have seen. So first adjustment that we saw was the borrowing requirement going down by roughly 20 billion rand. This is wonderful. Debt is arguably one of the biggest adjustments and the most welcome adjustments that we have seen in this MTBPS. We've also seen debt to GDP stabilize. They've said that this year we will stabilize. It was revised upwards a bit, as you can see there, from 77.4% to 77.7%, but they stand firm at us stabilizing in 2025-26. And then the debt service cost, another revision here. You can see that it is revised downwards. And important to note here is that although it still consumes 22% of all revenue, it is now revised to grow at 3.6% per year. So it's from that balance, it's revised to grow at 3.6% every year. But this is much, much better than the 7.4% that they set out at the beginning of the year for the big budget. So very welcome news indeed. And this is just a picture of our debt as a proportion of GDP since the start of our democratic era. You can see clearly there on the far left hand that debt was at below 50% of GDP. And then came 2007, we managed to cut it to almost half. And this was again under Trevor Manuel's second budget. And then since we've tripled it to now our 77.9% revised estimate. And this is obviously an excellent example of how government has been unwilling over the past decade to make those tough decisions to actually cut spending. And instead, they have relied on heavier borrowing, and we've seen much slower growth, which has just fed into this debt reliance. As a point of interest, debt service costs have been revised downwards, as I've said, but it still consumes roughly 1.2 billion rand every day, which is a lot of money. And this is equivalent to that 22%, 22 cents of every rand that we collect in tax. I usually like to explain it a little bit in a different example. 22 cents is very hard to imagine what to do with it. I like to think that with 220 rand, for every 1,000 rand that I pay in tax, I can do a lot with 220 rand. So why does it matter to understand our gross debt to GDP ratio? So the main reason is that the more debt we have, the less money we have available for other services. And then, of course, this is not what austerity looks like. We've seen some positive signs in this MTBPS, but up until now, we've seen a narrative and a story that does not tell the tale of austerity. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the important takeaways that I think are noteworthy from this budget. Firstly, we've had a wonderful grey listing win. Excellent news to see. We have, of course, seen the S&P is meeting tomorrow, and they will have either an upgrading for us. I'm sure Chris and I and Ofentse will discuss that a little bit in more detail afterwards. Then, of course, we've seen various tailwinds over the past year that was not necessarily expected earlier in the year. And included in these are just the global commodity prices and supply chain shifts that we've seen, and how this has, of course, positively affected and created this environment for South Africa that we can take advantage of. Then an important note, and this is something that I picked up in a difference in tone from the previous budget, is that last year the growth strategy was very much focused on infrastructure and getting the private sector involved. And although it is still important this year, there was a shift in the growth strategy towards macroeconomic stability. And I do believe that Minister Godongwana has set the tone for a countervailing fiscal force, which will be in favor of South Africa's long-term economic growth. Of course, this does not resolve all our policy problems. We should keep it in mind. One good budget does not mean that our policy problems are done away with. The government remains the biggest risk to the private sector, particularly when it comes to investing in national infrastructure. It is incredibly important to see follow through on these reforms that they have proposed. And then, of course, a note on the GNU. I believe that this is perhaps the start of reform. It is a very positive budget that was delivered with very little disagreement after the drama we've had earlier this year. But of course, not reading into any tea leaves here, and not saying that we might not see drama in the next budget delivered in February next year. But some of the positive signs, including the inflation target, might start to show some reform. Very well. That is all from my side. Thank you very much. Chris, back to you.
Thank you very much, Anlu, for an excellent presentation, unpacking so much of that data in the latest mini budget. It's interesting how we do things in the South African context with the main budget early in the year. Well, this year we had a few attempts at a main budget, and then we have the mini budget later in the year. And then it's also, of course, the mini budget is linked to the main budget again in the next year. So we'll see now how this feeds into February next year, what is taken forward, what isn't, etc., etc. We've got quite a few comments and questions. Thank you all very much in the audience for sending those through. I do remind you, please continue to submit those as we go into our discussion and Q&A part of the briefing now. Anlu, I just want to ask you a bit about the we've seen the Reserve Bank over the last 2 years or so, through people such as the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, and others, they've really pushed for this fixed low inflation target of 3%. So used to be the Reserve Bank had the target band of between 3% to 6%. Now we're going for a fixed target of 3%. And based on yesterday's speech by the Minister Gorongwana, National Treasury is also now on the same page. So not as rocky as a road, at least between those two entities, I thought it might have been. When the Reserve Bank Governor floated this earlier this year, Minister Gorongwana, he reacted almost with frustration that this is being floated. Why is this being aired in public? Let's discuss it in private first and sort it all out, and then we can almost come out together and communicate it. What do you think of a lower fixed target for an emerging market like South Africa? What are some of the biggest upsides, positives? What are some of the biggest risks of now going to a 3% target?
Yeah, the inflation adjustment or target adjustment is, of course, very, very important. The minister has now formally revised it. And I quite like how you said Lesetja Kganyago floated the idea. It really was a very deliberate floating. But yeah, of course, we now have the target of 3%. Keep in mind, it does have a tolerance band of 1%, so it's more like a 2 to 4%, but it is down from our previous 3 to 6%, as you mentioned. Now, this is very important for the simple reason, and I quite like to explain it with this calculation. So there's something called the rule of 72, and without having to explain the whole calculation behind it, it's just a quick way of estimating how long it would take prices to double, depending on the rate of inflation. So if we have the 4.5% that we currently had, it would take 16 years for the price of your milk to double. I understand that it obviously sounds like a long time, but 16 years for the price of your milk to double is not good. Inflation is never a good thing. So, well, at least not in this context. So if you take that same formula and you apply to the 3% inflation target that we now have, it will take 24 years for prices to double. So it is incredibly important for us to have seen this adjustment. And then, of course, in the short term, reducing it will have a series of positive effects. It can potentially have more interest rate cuts than we would have seen under the 4.5% target. And then over time, the lower target will obviously decrease inflation expectations and inflation with it. And this can potentially create more space for permanently lower interest rates. There is, however, the risk that lower inflation can feed through, initially at least, into slower GDP or economic growth. And of course, revenue growth. And this is because tax receipts, or the revenue that government collects, is very dependent on the economic activity and the prices that businesses charge, the taxes that business will at the end of the day pay. So this can reduce our fiscal space, to use the economic term. It just can affect the revenue of government and the economic growth rate in the short term, at least. But all in all, I do think it was a necessary adjustment, and happy to see that it came with relatively little drama.
Yes, indeed. Maybe we earlier this year, what we had to go through with 2 failed budgets and then the third confirmed one, we did. Maybe in some ways we were prepared for that to happen again this time around. But one of our comments links to that, and we had just last weekend we had the latest meeting of the GNU leaders. Now, this meeting came after 177 days. That was when the previous meeting was held between the leaders of the 10 parties that make up the government of national unity. And on that point, Ofentse, I'm going to bring you in here. I think on the data points that Anlu has highlighted, if you look at trajectories, things like the debt level possibly stabilizing, if next year it is consistent with what Treasury is projecting, I think it'll be the first time in 25 years that our debt to GDP is going to peak and then hopefully start to decline. So if you put that in that long-term context, we haven't had a period of austerity. We've been trying to spend our way out of trouble, but we haven't been doing the policy reforms to get the growth going. Ofentse, what are you seeing maybe from that latest GNU meeting, this budget on the reform side? What are you focusing on to tell you that the GNU is focusing on getting sort of the growth side of things right, that they're not just maybe trying to stabilize a sinking ship, or that they're, it's not a case of some parties being co-opted perhaps by the ANC? Is there anything in specific that you're looking at, maybe from this budget or indeed from the latest GNU meeting?
Yes, so the GNU, or rather the government of South Africa, is slowly but surely beginning to realize that you can't spend your way to growth, and spending without productivity just leads to a burdened debt increase. So it's nice to see that after the GNU meeting, although I doubt that the retreat they had any influence on the fiscal decisions that were made, but it's nice to see that there's some sort of political cohesion now, and there was no drama this time around in this budget policy statement. There's now an understanding that spending has to be moderate. There were no populist redistributive new initiatives that were announced that we have seen in the past. There were no increases in the SRD grants, and there were talks as well that they may consider not because it's due to expire or end next year, April, I believe. So that'll now be in a review caused by the collection in tax revenue, the overestimate collection in tax revenue, which is something that should be welcomed. There is a sign that populism is not the name of the game, and there's an inch of austerity measures that are sneaking their way into the fiscal and into the government agenda. So this is very much, it's not the regular ANC budget that we are so used to. There have been contributions from the Deputy Finance Minister, Asho Sarapen, from the DA. We can see it's very much an ANC and DA budget, although the austerity measures are not at the levels that the DA would like them to be. Social spending is still up, but it did not exponentially increase. There were no radical ideas that were put out there, and we saw this with the market sentiments as well. There's now an incentive that's being brought onto the table to the markets, especially with the lower inflation rates. Markets, or actually anyone, the behavior of anyone is determined by incentives. So if the low inflation rate, markets are now incentivized for long-term investments. The GNU will now be incentivized to watch their political prioritizations. Issues like NHI were not the headlines that we saw. So there are now some trade-offs that are being made by all the parties. The DA is not complaining about the social spending, but the ANC as well is not complaining about the lack of new social initiatives.
Just on that NHI point, I have to give a shout out to Minister Godongwana for talking about his concerns around medical tax credits and removing those, which we've seen floated recently by the Department of Health, contradicting what apparently was put forward beforehand. So we've had various healthcare associations talking about their concerns that on the one hand, the Department of Health says these will they won't be removed, or at least they won't affect certain groups, but then putting out other statements that contradict those. So I'm glad the minister pushed back on that idea in public. Anlu, just a point around market sentiment. The Rand strengthened quite a bit yesterday evening on the back of the budget, almost touching 17 to the dollar. Who would have thought almost a year into the second presidency of Donald Trump, that the Rand would be anywhere close to 17 to the dollar. We also had the yield on the South African 10-year bond dropping to the lowest level since 2021. And also don't underestimate how important that is for government debt, for borrowing, broadly for managing the sort of debt situation when our yields decline on our bonds. But just on the sentiment point, are you seeing enough in this mini budget, maybe tied to the main budget earlier this year, that tells you, the positive sentiment we've seen on the JSE, on markets, that is going to be realized in real economic growth, in GDP, let's say between 1.5 to 1.8%. I know I'm not aiming terribly high. We should be really getting between 5 and 8% for an emerging market with our population size, our resource endowment, all of that kind of thing. I'd take all that. But we've seen 18 months of positive market sentiment from the GNU. Are you seeing some signs that we're going to see this feeding into higher real growth?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is that when I prepared before the medium-term budget was set or tabled, I was thinking about what do we need to get out of this budget for it to actually be considered a good budget. And one of the things was that we needed Minister Enoch Godongwana to separate the one-offs from the fundamentals. Because we saw these tailwinds, as I mentioned earlier, commodity prices, the gold price, the rand to the dollar strengthening, all of these acted as tailwinds, and we needed him to obviously capitalize on this. But with it, I have to mention that obviously depending on these is not reliable in the long term, because obviously changes in those immediately affect our own estimates and our own projections. So we needed him firstly to take these easy wins that are essentially handed to us or available to us. But it's important to note that the permanent credibility demands a willingness to actually trade. And I think this is a quote that I got somewhere, trade that political applause for institutional applause. And that's incredibly important. We need him to, although we still see things like social spending and increases in grants, or increases in social wages, it's important for him to prioritize macroeconomic stability. That said, I do think the shift that I highlighted earlier does indicate longer term shift in how they want to drive economic growth. And this is the shift away from just thinking that, listen, let's just spend more on infrastructure. It is incredibly important. Infrastructure has many multiplier effects that we need to increase spending up on. But monetary stability is our first responsibility. And I do think that shift that we saw from just spending more towards having monetary stability is a very important shift that can potentially lead to longer term economic growth.
Very much so. I think that's especially important to highlight in a more volatile global environment where we've seen some pulling out of capital, even from places like the US, questions about the Federal Reserve, about the sort of sanctity of the dollar. All of those kinds of things are factoring into more uncertain global capital flows. And for emerging markets to really make themselves attractive, like there really is every opportunity if we just get some of these basics right on infrastructure, crime, corruption, how much we could get in terms of inflows of capital. That would be quite remarkable. Anlu, I'm just going to stick with you, Ofentse, before I go to you again. Anlu, just a question around infrastructure spending and maybe more targeted spending and growth. I mean, as highlighted in the comments, someone like economist Davhie has highlighted beforehand how very little we get for government spending. So for every rand that we spend, we almost that the government spends, it's almost a case of wealth being destroyed, not being generated. And that ties to things like cadre deployment, corruption, waste, what former Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter referred to as non-value adding intermediaries, that are things involved in public procurement, BEE, that sort of thing, just that waste of money that goes to things that really ought not to services and products. But just on the infrastructure point, you've written the last 2 years research papers for the Institute of Race Relations, part of the Blueprint for Growth series of papers on infrastructure. And in this mini budget yesterday, we had National Treasury indicating they would issue an infrastructure bond of at least 15 billion rand as the government steps up efforts to revive public investment and attract private capital into long-stalled projects. The bond will be issued under the Budget Facility for Infrastructure special window, targeting so-called shovel-ready projects in critical sectors. Do you think this gets us in the right sort of route on infrastructure investment, real fixed investment that we so often highlight that the CRA is the most important number in South Africa, where our fixed investment has always been around 13 to 15% of GDP, and we should be between 25 and 30%. And maybe just add, if you think it's in the right route, what else on the policy space needs to happen to get local and foreign businesses to invest in fixed, tangible assets in South Africa, not just buying stocks on the JSE and that kind of thing. That's relatively easy versus sinking one's, capital into the country.
Yes. Okay. So first on the point of the budget facility for infrastructure projects, or the BFI projects, and then that bond that you just mentioned that they're launching to raise the 15 billion rand. So if the projects funded through the bond, the revenue raised from the bond, produce more economic value than the costs of borrowing that money, then issuing the bond is sensible. Because infrastructure lifts growth and it improves logistics and it reduces future costs. So it's good in the sense that it essentially pays for itself over time if it creates more economic value than the cost of borrowing it. The bond also, in some sense, you can explain it as spreading the costs, because obviously many of these assets, infrastructure assets, have long lifetimes. So it spreads the cost of these assets over many years, and that can be useful. And then, of course, it's also useful in the sense that it mobilizes private capital, which we've heard government speaking of, Treasury specifically, in the last several budgets. So it does mobilize private capital, and with that comes including private expertise in finance, or private expertise specifically, which obviously comes with that finance and that capital. However, on the other side of the coin, if the projects that the revenue raised from these bonds, if those projects that are funded are badly chosen, or they are delayed, or they are mismanaged, then government ends up with more debt without any economic gains. And that will obviously need to be justified. So a bond, a bond increases the debt service costs down the line, or that bill down the line, if the revenue raised from it doesn't actually outweigh that extra debt servicing costs as well. So what is incredibly important in understanding whether this is a good idea or not is that the quality of the project, whether they actually lift productivity, whether they finished on time or within budget, what the interest rates on the bonds are, and obviously how it then affects our growth trajectory is very, very important. And all those factors will affect whether this is a sensible idea or not at the end of the day. And then to your second point, which is on what does government actually need to do to get more private capital into infrastructure investments. And one of the most important things is credibility. Anyone who wants to invest in assets and infrastructure, that gross fixed capital formation you mentioned, the tangible things in a country, they need credibility, they need confidence in the country. And we establish confidence in our economic environment by having rating agencies give us positive reviews. So already the review that we've had or getting off the grey list that we were on for the Financial Action Task Force is a wonderful move in the right direction. And it would be a cherry on top if we do get more upgrades, especially considering the S&P coming out with their findings and their meeting tomorrow.
Very good. Ofentse, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to highlight one of the comments here from Dirk. Good to see you, Dirk. Thank you very much for joining us and your questions and comments. Ofentse, around the relationship with the US, if one looks at possible US restrictions on US companies buying South African government bonds and also then individuals being sanctioned, any updates from your side on the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act? We consistently track that at the CRA. We mention any updates to our clients in the Monday morning risk alerts every Monday morning at 7 a.m. We put out client notes and other pieces of research and analysis on pieces of legislation, such as this particular Review Act, it's called an act, but it's still a bill because it hasn't been passed just yet, just to quibble. But Ofentse, anything you're seeing on that front? I think broadly to the South African government and to the ANC, they continue to underestimate President Trump and how he's implementing more transactional steps to get trading partners in other countries. If he thinks they're implementing policies that he disagrees with, he's trying to put pressure on them. So I think, they would be they would be remiss to think he and his colleagues wouldn't implement targeted sanctions at some point and try and apply more fiscal pressure on South Africa. Do you think that's a reasonable assessment?
So to start off, I think the US placing a restriction on US companies, that would be a step a bit too far. It's not something, it's not a real risk that we're looking towards. However, we're still within the first 12 months of the Trump administration. So anything can happen next year, the year after, and the year after that. But that's not a risk that that's on high alert. It's very much on low alert. But however, in terms of the US-SA Bilateral Relations Review Act, which is actually a bill, we have seen it now, and there are two forms of it that's currently in the US Congress, one in the House level and one in the Senate level. The fact that there are two of them shows that there is an appetite for this bill to pass, and it's very much in the agenda in Washington. They just came out of a 43-day shutdown now, so they will start prioritizing other issues as well, and not only domestic issues. So we can expect South Africa to come up on the headlines again very soon. The Review Act, although it does only target specific individuals, and to be more particular, or to be more specific, it targets ANC politicians, and it does list a few in those bills. And that is a real threat that the ANC is probably anticipating. I think they are seeing it coming, especially because they're not moving the needles in terms of the demands that President Trump is making in terms of BEE and classifying farm murders as a high priority crime, condemning Kill the Boer chant, and so on. They haven't even made an attempt on that. The only attempt that they have done in terms of trying to score a deal and to normalize relations is purely on the trade side. The Department of Trade, Industry and Competition under Minister Pakstau, and as well as the DGs and so on, have been doing their job to give them their credit. They are in contact with the United States Trade Representative, and they speak nearly every month. I don't know if it's weekly, but definitely monthly. And a deal is something that we can anticipate, but at the same time, we don't know when. And even President Ramaphosa himself, when he was in Switzerland, he was being questioned by the media during a press conference, and he gave an update on the trade deal, and he said we can expect a deal maybe next week, or maybe next month, or maybe in 3 months. So the uncertainty is from down here amongst us analysts all the way up to the highest official in the country. No one really knows whether a deal will be struck, but there is constant communications between the two nations in terms of trying to score a deal. With being more creative in trying to score this deal, we've seen that President Trump has been gifted gifts such as a golden golf ball or a Rolex from the Swiss government, and that has helped to take the tariffs down. Very, very unorthodox, but it's something. It should allow the South African government just to be a bit more creative. Not saying they should give him a jet or anything like that, but try to think outside the box and trying to score a deal, because the Department of Trade has been doing its role and nothing is coming out of it. So we need to think outside the box.
Very much so. On the point around the trade deals broadly and whether South Africa might get one or not, even to lower our 30% tariff rate by 1%, never mind 10 or 20%. In the last week or so, we've been referring to the trade deals. People will be familiar with the thought experiment, but we've been talking about these trade deals as Schrodinger's trade deals. So they're at all times, they're both dead and alive, the current US trade deals under this administration, because at any point they could re-look at trade deals on national security grounds, national security or strategic concerns, and adapt them accordingly. With India, it's ostensibly around buying Russian oil, and it's 50%. With Brazil, it's more domestic political concerns. It's also 50%. So even if one has a sort of signed trade deal, I don't think government should then sit back and say, there won't be volatility with this administration going forward. And Anlu, I'm going to bring you in there. That's why it's so important for South Africa to get its fiscal house in order, that we're not as exposed to these global headwinds when they do happen. I worry a bit in the last sort of 18, 12 months, the fact that we've had a mini commodity boom and we've had higher tax revenue come in by SARS. in that regard, that might give our government again this wiggle room to say, look, things aren't that bad. We've got 30% tariffs. What are we worried about? Like, we're still stabilizing our debt situation. We're growing at 1.2, 1.4%. You know, what's there to be worried about?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very serious concern. South Africa's bond market is highly dependent on foreign capital. If I'm not mistaken, it's historically something like 30% of government bonds being held by international investors. And that would, of course, mean that it would make it significantly more expensive for the government to finance its existing debt if there is any shifts in US, if they firstly have to attract non-US buyers, and secondly, any shifts in international relations in this sense. If Trump comes out and says that they are not allowed to buy South African government bonds anymore, this would have significant implications for our interest rates and our debt trajectory that we've just set ourselves on. And then I think important for Minister Godongwana, what we should have seen, what I have not really seen enough of on this topic, is that I would have liked for them to more clearly model whether the primary surplus was largely cyclical. I think it's very important for, apologies for my dog barking, it is very important to explain that this adjustment path that we've just set ourselves on, whether this is dependent on, say, the commodity boom, and how that obviously affects our own markets. As I mentioned earlier, we do need him and Treasury to take advantage of this window. We need them to take advantage of the cyclical upturn that we've seen in revenues and global conditions. But yeah, we do need him to not confuse that with that short-term luck with our own competence necessarily. And yeah, I think obviously if Treasury uses the tailwinds, these commodity upticks and the revenue increase that we've seen, if they use that to spend more on infrastructure and they essentially avoid the VAT increase that we have scheduled for next year, that's set to bring in 20 billion rand additional revenue, it would be important for them to, rather than spend this on infrastructure, and offer some relief to households. And I think that would essentially allow us to put ourselves on a trajectory where we don't depend so much on these commodity upswings and global markets.
Definitely. It's not going to be to South Africa's benefit to once again think that a commodity upswing is always going to be there, and we can just not worry about the policy impediments that our governments choose to impose and that inhibit capital formation, investment, and job creation and growth. Ofentse, to you, next year, towards the end of next year, early 2027, we'll have our next local government elections on polling, on sentiment. Looks like the ANC is cruising for a bruising, so probably going to perform even worse than they did in 2024. The upswing of parties like the Democratic Alliance and others. Broadly, our politics becoming more competitive, so voters becoming a bit more, I think, sort of skeptical about parties. They're shopping around. It's by no means guaranteed if they voted for one party in a previous election that 100% they will vote for that party again. You've really got to work for and earn their votes. One of the points in local government elections really focus where voter priorities are focused a lot on what we call bread and butter issues. So we see this in our polling year after year. Service delivery issues. If you open a tap, you expect water to come out. If you're paying your bills and you flip a light switch, you expect the lights to turn on. All those kinds of things are going to be priorities. On that point, in the latest mini budget, there's talk of a municipality utility reform program, which is going to be launched in Mpumalanga in the municipalities of Mbombela, Governor Mbeki, Lekwa, and Emalahleni. This particular program aims to stabilize and professionalize core municipal utilities, such as water and electricity, by reducing losses, introducing cost-reflective tariffs with protections for poor households, ring-fencing of revenues, improving asset care, and enhancing governance and reporting. All sounds great, but I don't see anything there around professionalizing the sort of system of individuals there, getting rid of things like cadre deployment, prioritizing those with the necessary political connections. Do you think, I mean, again, it's hinting in the right direction, but it's just not going far enough? What do you think?
Yeah, I can tell that because the Minister of COGTA, the minister in charge of municipalities, is from the IFP. You can sense an input from Minister Velenkosini Tlhabisa and from the IFP. So just reaffirming that this is a GNU policy statement and not just an ANC one. However, it just sounds like a lot of words and difficult to implement policies, the policy initiatives that we see a lot of. It sounds good on paper, but when it's time to implement it, it's a different situation. Like you mentioned, does it have ways to mitigate the risks of corruption and the impacts of cadre deployment and so on? Looks good on paper, but nothing to take too seriously. And speaking of the local government elections next year, it's good to note that in the budget policy statement, there weren't any populist redistributive offerings that the ANC minister put on table to try to capitalize on scarcity. So scarcity populism, high inequality, high unemployment. So perfect opportunity to raise social spending and raise public wages and implement new social initiatives, increase the SRD grant. None of that was done. So it's a good sentiment to the market to show, hey, this time around our fiscal discipline is up and there's no electoral politics playing around when planning around the budget.
Yeah, definitely. I think this trend that we've highlighted quite a bit in today's discussion around getting at least our sort of fiscal institutional space, that house in order, that counts for a lot. And given our politics is probably going to be more competitive for at least the next decade or so, if not longer, this new era of coalition politics that we highlighted for many years before 2024. It's so important to get those institutions right and sort of depoliticize them as much and as far as possible. Anlu, I'm going to come to you as we start to wrap up here. Just your final thoughts on the mini budget, what you might be excited for, because you'll read so many spreadsheets and look at all the data, up until the late hours of the evening. What you're going to look at for signs into the next main budget, probably to be delivered in February or March next year, coming out of this mini budget that you think that we should be looking at, maybe that businesses should be monitoring, anything on that front?
Yeah, so as a first mention, perhaps, it has largely gone under the radar. I think I've read one or two articles on the topic, but the minister also announced that a new SOE and infrastructure finance and implementation support agency will be established by March of next year. And then that this agency will provide project preparation, essentially. So they will help those budget facility infrastructure projects that we spoke about earlier. They will help these projects with the planning phases. But it's essentially just a new SOE. And we have not really seen too much serious credibility coming out of our SOEs over the past decade. So they have their work cut out for them if they are to be successful. Main takeaways from the budget, I genuinely am very optimistic about the budget. I do think it was rosy, to say the least. I think the inflation adjustment is a wonderful shift. It will take, implementation will be for the next 2 years. But I think we should keep an eye open for some of these positive feed-throughs that will start coming from this. And then, of course, the VAT, we need to keep that in mind for next year's budget, depending on whether revenue is collected at the rate which Treasury is expecting it to be collected. We might see the VAT increase of 0.5% not coming into effect next year. Of course, our debt hoping to see next year that it does actually stabilize at 77.9% and that does not increase. So there's a series of positive reforms that have come out of this budget, and that I do think will assist us in hopefully growing our economy going into the next year. Obviously, depending on many of our policy reforms, also having to follow through on this. And yeah, I think that overall the minister has set that tone in favor of long-term economic growth.
Definitely. Ofentse, any parting thoughts from your side? I'm sure you're very excited for the G20 summit next week. Anything on that you're going to monitor, implications for the GNU and indeed through the rest of this year for people to keep in mind?
I will be monitoring it. I'll be watching what the G19, maybe now G18, because Argentina also isn't joining along with the US. But I will be watching the developments that will be taking place. Despite those two leaders not joining, it is still a significant moment. It's a reinforcement of multilateralism and the support for it, despite the outliers. And even if a communique comes out and the US does not support it, at the end of the day, we're getting these world leaders from the biggest economies coming in Johannesburg under one roof, speaking of an agenda. So even if there's no multilateral agreement, there will be numerous bilateral agreements. And the agenda that South Africa has for the G20, it can still implement it post the G20 summit with its respective trading partners within the G20. So definitely something to look out on. And also just a final touch on the mini budget is that there's no taxes, there's no threats of new taxes coming in, and there's actually a review on whether there will be a tax increase that was initially proposed in the budget that was accepted this year. That is something that we should all welcome, that we should all celebrate, and it's a nice political point for the GNU. This will build trust amongst the GNU, despite the lack of structural reform and the slow growth and the joblessness that keeps remaining high. This is a step forward, and we should celebrate it and look out for it.
No, definitely. On that point around employment, we had the latest employment data this week as well from Stats SA, and an improvement in our unemployment rate. I know just marginally, but the sector that led that downward turn, that positive turn, was construction. So I want to see those sectors: construction, manufacturing, agriculture. Agriculture, of course, more seasonal. But if we start to see those sectors, more labor absorption in those sectors, you're going to see, I think, the positive feed through into growth if we get positive quarter-on-quarter employment data for the next 2 or 3 quarters. So all in all, lots for us to think about and digest. Some very good signs, I think, from this latest mini budget. And we've been so used to the vicious cycle in the South African context, it does become difficult to talk about and even consider that things might be shifting in a more positive direction. So I think we've highlighted those as well as we can, along with still the serious policy and legislative risks that remain, that could just continue to hold back South Africa's potential growth. But on that note, Anlu, Ofentse, thank you both so much for your time, for all of your hard work before today's session, for your analysis. To all of you who joined us, thank you very much for giving of your time this morning with the CRA. If you are not yet a premium client of the CRA, we invite you to take out a subscription. You can contact myself or Ofentse. You can get all of our details on the CRA website. Get in touch with us today. Let's give you the data and analysis that your business needs in this exciting new geopolitical and indeed more competitive domestic political environment to grow in South Africa. On that note, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.